So hello everybody. Thank you for coming along tonight. So what we're going to look at tonight particularly is about how you would go about choosing the right subjects and specifications that you want to look at for your home educated child taking exams. Do you want to just pop onto the first slide, Sarah? So Sarah and I will talk through some points that we think are going to be useful to you. You can pop anything in the chat as a question as you go along, just as you think about it. There are no stupid questions. We have all been in a position where we knew nothing about it. Anything, if you're thinking of something, somebody else will be wondering it too. So do put it in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer it. It doesn't have to be about what we're talking about now. If you've got any questions, we will probably leave those till the end, but we'll get to it if we can. So the things that we're going to focus on today are basically the key issues that you've got to think about for any subject and any specification. And then we'll narrow down on deciding the actual subjects. And then once you've decided what subjects you want to look at, then we'll look at how you then choose a board for that subject. And we'll explain a little bit about what that means, because you may not know that. And then we'll go through a few of the more popular subjects about what are particularly, what to think about for those options. And then we'll have a period for any questions you've got at the end. So should we pop onto the overview, Sarah? So, the first thing is we're going to mostly be talking about GCSEs, not entirely, but that's the sort of stage and age that most people are thinking about when they're looking at exams. Sorry. And so the key thing you're thinking about there is what subjects you want to do, then there's different boards that you can choose for those. So we'll talk through how you go about choosing that, how you find out about them. We have done a previous webinar which covers the general process of doing exams, how you go about finding an exam centre, how the process breaks down. So that is on the HEQA YouTube channel. So if you're watching this and you think, I've no idea what you're talking about in the first place, what's an exam centre? That's the place to go and look at. So for now, the main thing is that you are choosing for your child. So if you're in school, you've got a list of things that they're going to have to do, and maybe you've got a few choices that you're told you can choose one of these 3 or 4 in this slot. So it's quite narrow. They've chosen what boards they are, you just choosing the subjects. When you're out of school, everything is up to you. So you have, that's great. You've got free choice. You can choose anything, but it also means that you have to choose everything. So you've got to make all those decisions, and you can do that for your child. You don't have to be matching the school system. You don't have to do the same subjects. You don't have to do them at the same time. And some of that comes down to choice. It comes down to you having a look at what they're going to be doing in the future and choosing what they want to do. Some of that comes down to particular limitations that make it harder if you're not in a school to do particular subjects. And the key one about that is if there are non-exam components, then that makes it a lot more difficult. So one of the key things about GCSEs, the thing that makes them valuable, essentially, they're kind of a currency. They're valuable because they kind of show that you've gone through a very particular process. And a big part of that is that it's guaranteed that it was your child that did it under certain circumstances. And the most obvious example of that is an exam. They show up, they've checked that it's your child, there's only your child, they're not allowed to talk to anybody else, so it's definitely all their own work on the bit of paper that then gets sent off and gets graded. So that's a very high level of verification. That's one of the benefits of the exams. And for a home educated child, that's fairly straightforward, because you take your child to the exam centre, they sit the exam, it's done. Some exams also include what we call non-exam assessment. That can be various different things. So if you think of coursework, that's the most obvious one, but there can also be practical assessments. Some of those can go over a long period of time. Some of them are in a particular, a 2-hour thing, but it's a practical, it's not a written exam. Now, those are often more difficult to do as a private candidate. Partly because, so in the case of coursework, they still need to have that level of verification. They still need to know that it was your particular child that did that work and that they didn't have any help that they weren't supposed to have. And the only way they can really do that is if the exam centre that's responsible for ensuring that supervises your child somehow during that process. So it's not as straightforward as you write a bit of coursework and you bring that along to the exam centre and they mark it, because that doesn't have that level of verification where they can be 100% sure that it was your child that did it and they didn't have any extra help. So it's that extra supervision that means things like coursework and practicals are a lot more difficult. They're not always impossible. There are some centres that are able to have arrangements that can do that supervision for you, but it does make it a lot more complicated. And in terms of, again, that extra level for exams that include non-exam assessment, what's available varies by location. So if you're close to a centre, or if you're close to a tutor group that is already set up to do that supervision, then that's great, but those aren't available everywhere. So if you wanted to do something like dance, which has a very big practical component, there are a couple of dance studios that have set themselves up to do GCSE dance. If you've got one of those close by, that's brilliant, you can do it. But if you're just on your own and there isn't that facility, it's probably going to be a lot more difficult. So that's one of the big things to be aware of when you're choosing subjects and specifications is, is it all exam? Because that's going to be more straightforward, or is it involving a non-exam assessment? And this is where international GCSEs quite often come in. So GCSEs are regulated by Ofqual, most of them, and they're defined by the government. So they're a particular qualification, they're set up by the government. So a maths GCSE has got a certain number of things that have to be included in it. And they're defined by the government. An international GCSE is it's a private company that has set up an exam that is very like the GCSE, but not regulated in the same way. So they have a little bit more flexibility with the international GCSEs. They are verified to be of the same difficulty and the same standard. So if you're looking at it from the point of view of a university or an employer looking back at those, they can say, okay, a maths international GCSE is just as hard. They know the same things as they do if they've done a regular GCSE. But what can be different is the way that it's set up for the assessment. They've got a bit more flexibility there. So that means that some things that have practical components in the GCSE don't have them in the international GCSE. So you'll often hear that home educators have to do international GCSEs, and that's not true across the board. But what is true is that there are some subjects where doing the international GCSE makes it easier to access an exam centre. So we'll get on to what particular subjects those are later. But the main thing about the international GCSE is it's basically a private version of the government regulated GCSEs. Same level of difficulty, it works the same in terms of progression onto college and onto university, but it's got a little bit more flexibility in how it's assessed. So sometimes there are different options for international GCSE than there are in the regular GCSEs. Now, tonight, we're probably not going to talk very much about A-levels. Essentially, all of the same principles apply to A-level as apply to GCSE. And we'll talk about how you go and find the specifics for any particular subject. You do the same for A-level, go and look at the specification itself. There are more A-level subjects that have coursework components than there are GCSEs. So you have to be a bit more careful there. And if you do want to do something with coursework, you often have to work through what we call a DLP, a distance learning provider. And there's someone that's set up to teach remotely, either through video or through sending you assignments and marking them. So that means they can kind of cover the supervision aspect if they're working alongside an exam centre. So yeah, you have to look at that for A-levels. There are, in the same way as there are international GCSEs, there are international A-levels. So one of the main boards, which we'll get onto in detail later, is Cambridge. They do an international A-level and the equivalent of an AS level. And again, they sometimes have options that don't include coursework, whereas the regular English A levels do. So there can be times you want to choose that. Very recently, Edexcel, who are one of the main boards, have introduced their international A levels into the UK. It used to be that you could only do the UK A levels from Edexcel here, and they had international A levels that they offered abroad, but not in the UK. For the last about year, I think, you've been able to sit those international A levels at particular centres within the UK. Now, they are somewhat different from the regular A levels in that they've got a modular structure. What that means is there's more exams throughout the year. I don't know exactly how many. I think it might be sort of one per term that build up to the full A level, instead of having all of your exams at the end of the 2 years like you do with in the English A levels. So there's pros and cons to that. It can be easier for a child to sit them. We don't really have a feel for how UK universities are going to respond to that coming from a UK child. So, you know, they do accept them coming from international students. They may well accept them just the same from a UK student, or they may say, I'm not so sure about that different structure. I'd rather you did the English ones. We just don't know how that's going to be received yet, because they haven't been out for very long. Is there anyone who's along tonight who is particularly interested in A levels? If so, pop in the chat and we'll try and talk a bit more about it as we go through. That's probably something we'll look at doing an individual webinar on at some point.
I'll just add to Katie's that Cambridge A levels, Cambridge International A levels are quite established in the UK.
Yes.
For access to university. It's the Edexcel that is the new aspect.
Yep, Cambridge International A levels been around for a long time, and they're very similar. Yeah, well, I don't think anyone's not hearing that anyone's particularly into A levels, so we won't go into the details on that too much now. If that is something you're looking at, I should just say now there is a Facebook group called HE Exams and Alternatives, and there is the HE Exams Wiki. Sarah, do you want to just flash up the exams wiki?
Yeah, that's a subjects page of it.
There we go, and we'll email out links to both of these. So the HE Exams Wiki has got a huge amount of information on everything to do with taking exams. So if you have a question and you go and have a look on that wiki, it will probably be there somewhere. And similarly, the Facebook group has got an awful lot of people that have done either GCSEs themselves, A levels themselves. They will be able to answer most questions. So if you've got something specific that you're thinking about, for instance, at A levels, those are the places to look. Okay, that was a bit more detail of an overview, but there we go.
Subjects. So how do you decide what subjects? So one of the first things to do is, if they've got an idea of what they want to do going forward, is have a look at what they might need for university courses that they might want to go on to, or level 3 courses, by which we mean BTECs, T levels, A levels. College websites tend to tell you what they need to get onto a particular course. They might be willing to be more flexible, but it's always worth starting from when you're roughly planning, what do I need? So we've if they don't know, I think an awful lot of teens will not know what they need, what they want to do going forward. Mine certainly didn't have a clue. We went with keeping as many options open as possible. So the way to do that, usually maths and English. Most things in life, jobs, courses, specify maths and English requirements. It's part of funding for level 3 course, for full-time level 3 courses to have or be studying. there's current talk about whether it will be funding for university as well, but an awful lot of jobs specify them as well. We'll come and look at different alternatives. I won't spend too much longer talking on those. Other aspects, science is a requirement for some careers, but not for others. English baccalaureate, which is English, language and lit, maths, either combined science or two of the core sciences or computer science, history or geography, and a modern language, or an ancient language actually. I found that out today. I thought it was a modern language, but apparently the ancient languages have been added to it. We don't need to follow them. We can do what our children like. So when we're trying to decide on subjects, what we need to consider is whether the subject's accessible. When we say maths or English, maths and English, usually we're referring to English language. And yes, English language and English literature are separate exams. At school, they're grouped as English, but they are two separate subjects.
They are at GCSE. A level, there is actually a possibility of a combined subject as well, but at GCSE, where you're looking at what are the main requirements, it's English language.
So you need to consider whether the subject you want to do is accessible before you set your heart on it, because it's no point deciding that you really, really wanted to do GCSE art and it's beyond your organisational skills and budget to arrange. So it's worth looking at the wiki. I've showed you the list of subjects. I'm scared to miss off it because it disappeared last time I did it. But it's worth checking that out. We will put links up when we send out information afterwards. And the specification itself is a phrase you hear bandied around on the exams group. But what we mean by the specification is each subject and each exam board has a list of what you need to learn for that subject with that exam board and how it's assessed. They are there on the exam board websites. You can find list on the Cambridge site. This is one of the Excel ones, and they come as a booklet you can download. So it tells you in these what they need to know and the assessment overviews, and these tell you how they're assessed, and it's always worth a read of those beforehand to check whether there is anything that is likely to cause you a problem with arranging. So it's okay to choose your course based on whatever you want to, what interests your child. We made some of our choices based on attending local tuition groups. In some cases because a friend was doing it. So in other cases because mum was teaching it and may as well come along for the ride. When requirements tipped off, if you need to do any extra, do what you like for fun. It's always worth. We're often asked, what are the easier subjects? The easiest subjects are the ones that interest them. And I will add the ones that interest you if you are going to be the primary educator. It is much easier to support them through a subject that you find interesting. I do have to say that. So I've lost my PowerPoint again. There it is. Oh. So I'll sit on and let Katie do the boards.
Yeah, I guess the other thing to say on subjects is about how many. And again, that is a case of looking at where you think you're going to want to go in the future. So that's looking at your local colleges. Some of, usually 5 is enough, but there are more colleges, particularly in more competitive areas, that might want 6 or 7, sometimes even 8. Again, if you're looking at a really competitive university course, if you're looking at sort of Cambridge or medicine, then you might want to be looking more towards the 8 subjects. If you're pretty sure you can get to where you want to go with 5 or even with fewer, that's all you need to do. Okay, so let's assume you've picked what subjects you're interested in. Don't be 100% sure on them yet, because we've got some more things to look at. So now you need to choose which board there are. So what an exam board is they are the company that writes the exam, decides what's going to be in it and what the format of the exam is. They write the exam, they send them out to the exam centre. The exam centre is the person that you get involved with when you're booking exams. So the exam centre it could be a school, it could be a tutorial centre, it could be a private centre. That's kind of the building that you actually go and you show up at, and your child sits down and writes the exam. The exam board are the people who have written the exam paper that gets sent out to the exam centre. And they take the papers back for marking in most cases. So there are, maybe count some boards. So in England, the main GCSE boards are AQA, Edexcel, OCR, and Educas, which is WJEC Educas, for GCSEs. For international GCSEs, there's Edexcel. Edexcel do both GCSE and international GCSEs, 2 separate things. And then there's Cambridge, who are also CAIE, and they only do international GCSEs. They don't have GCSEs. So that's it. Cambridge board is short for CAIE, which is Cambridge Assessment International Education, I think. There are also, so that's within England. Scotland has its own system. They have national 5s. A lot more of those involve coursework. So it tends to be that if you're home educating in Scotland, you will still choose either one of the English GCSEs or international GCSEs, and you have to find an exam centre that will let you sit them there, because the Nat 5s are much more difficult to do. Now in Wales, they also have their own GCSEs that are different to the English ones. So they are done by the WJEC CBAC board. They often, again, there are more of those that have coursework. So Welsh home educators may choose to do the English ones. There are a few of them that exam only. You can choose either one. Yeah, I'll do that. So there's also Northern Ireland. They've got their own exam board, CCEA, similar thing to Wales. They're GCSEs, but they're a different specification, and they're regulated differently to the English ones. So for the GCSE boards, there's AQA. Oh, perfect. Somebody's put them into the chat. So AQA are the biggest one that schools use most often. Edexcel is probably the one home educators use most often, partly because they've got both the international GCSEs and the GCSEs, and partly because they're often supported by private centres, which we'll just get onto. Educas is WJEC. They're not used all that much. There's also OCR, which is, I think it stands for Oxford and Cambridge Regional, but I can't quite remember that. They're a sister organisation to the Cambridge, who do the international GCSEs. Cambridge is used a reasonable amount. Cambridge, because it doesn't do GCSEs, it only does international GCSEs, and state schools, state-funded schools in England are essentially very, very heavily discouraged from using international GCSEs, to the point that very few of them do anymore. So that means if you're sitting at a state school, they almost certainly won't do Cambridge exams. That means, and for an exam centre, so this point we're going to get onto is, can you find a centre that lets you sit that exam board? So an exam centre needs to be registered with the exam board in order to offer those exams. And each of the exam boards has different arrangements for that, but that will it certainly involves a bit of extra paperwork for them to be registered with a new board. It sometimes involves a minimum spend, so a certain amount of financial outlay in order to use a new board. So that means that if, for instance, the place you want to sit your exams is a local state secondary school, they probably won't have a registration with Cambridge. So these days, there are fewer exam centres around that have that exam board with the Cambridge board to allow them to sit those those international GCSEs. There are certainly still centres that do that. So this is where it gets down to what's available in your local area. So if you know that there's an exam centre, which could be a school, it could be a private centre, it could be a tutorial centre. On the wiki, there's a list of known exam centres in an area. Ask other home educators in your area, and they should be able to point you at where the local options are. Then those exam centres will support a certain number of boards. So the first step is always, is there a place that I can sit that exam? Because if you decide that say the OCR specification looks great, you really like that, but the only place that you can sit it is 4 hours drive away, then that's probably going to outweigh the fact that the other spec isn't as nice, but you can sit it at your local school. So you want to have an idea at least of where you're going to be able to sit them. We'll send out a link to the wiki. Actually, Sarah, can you pop the link in the chat for people here, maybe?
I remember it. I was just thinking I'm going to have to interrupt your screen to actually.
Yes, that's no problem.
There we go.
So yeah, it very much depends on where you are locally. So if you've lots of the private centres will support all of the different boards. Some of them will only support, they may only support HEQA, they may only support Edexcel. You've got to find out about your local area. And I mean, if you're prepared to travel, you're going to be able to find something somewhere. It's a question of how prepared you are to travel. It's weighing up the convenience of what's available locally against what you really want to do. But it's definitely something to bear in mind when you're choosing an exam. If basically there's no particular preference, choose the one you can sit easier. And the other issue with exam centres is sometimes you don't know if you're going to be able to find or what exam centres you will have available to you in a couple of years' time. Again, if you're near a stable private centre or a school that always offers them, that's probably fine. Some areas, it's a bit more risky. It kind of comes and goes what's available for support. And then some boards, for instance, Edexcel, they're just more likely to be able to find somewhere. But it doesn't rule anything out. Just have a look. It varies very much where you are. Some areas are great and they've got lots of options, but some areas aren't, and that's an issue we're sort of working on in the background, but it's quite a difficult thing to solve. So the question in the chat, is there a particular exam board that's better suited for a child with dyslexia? I think not across all subjects. You sort of have to look at each of them individually. So I think, what is the difference between the boards? So between international GCSE and GCSE, there's more differences typically, or there can be more differences. As I've said, they're all at the same level of difficulty. It's not the case that one is easier than another. They're all similar sorts of difficulty, similar standards of things, but perhaps the way that they ask questions might be different. The way that they separate up the exam papers might be different. Sometimes the topics that they choose are different. And of course, whether they've got non-exam assessment or not can be different, and that can be a really big factor. We'll get onto this a bit more in the particular subjects about maths and English, and that will give you, an overview of the sorts of things that can be different to look at for other subjects. So, I mean, that's kind of in terms of structure here, which is how have they decided to split up the topics between papers. So, I mean, it could be as simple as they've each got 2 papers. One of them puts all of the topics spread over both papers. one of them focuses half the topics on paper 1, half the topics on paper 2. There's no easier or harder, it's just a different way of doing things, and you might prefer one over the other. Some of them might split it over 3 papers, some might do it over 2 that are a bit longer. Cambridge, I think, sometimes have entire papers that are multiple choice. They might have different essays, so there's different ways of looking at things. The next thing is the style. Again, that's just the way that they phrase questions, sorts of things they tend to do, how sometimes, so I find some boards are often quite predictable in the way they ask questions, and some boards can mix that up a bit more. So again, you may just find a style of questions looks like it suits you better than another style. They might have longer, like one long essay in one board and several shorter questions in another board, and you might prefer one of those styles over the other one. Okay, so we've got a question about functional maths and English. We'll talk about those when we look at the maths options and the English options. And the other thing that can be a reason to choose one board over another is the resources that are available. So the exam boards will put up extra things. So they will all put up the specification that Sarah showed earlier, which is the list of things that are in there. And we'll look at that in a second, I think. And they will all put up some past papers or sample papers, which are the exams that have been sat before. So you can look at those to get an idea, a further idea of what the exam will actually look like. But a lot of them also put up other information. So they might put up something called a scheme of work. And that's a suggestion of how you could break it up into lessons. They're obviously targeted at a classroom, but you can still use those if you want to split up your own idea of what you should be working on, you know, for each week in over 60 weeks leading up to a 2-year, you know, on a 2-year exam schedule. So that can help you. They often have topic guides sometimes. They can have getting started guides and just more information that will help you learn about that subject. And again, different boards will have different things that are available there. So you might decide that this board has got lots of extra information that looks really helpful to help me learn that subject. So I'm going to go with them rather than anybody else. And the place to look for all of these things is on the exam board website. So do you want, if you bring up?
We do this one, just,
yeah,
I'm quite familiar with this one. So
yes.
as at cell, you can see teaching and learning materials. They've actually got 164 bits of information because there's an awful lot of options for history. But this gives you an idea of some of what's available. Now, this is a subject with a lot in comparison to others. So it can help you, you know, that's there. If you are the one that's going to lead it, then sometimes it's useful to know how much resources you've got available.
And another thing to bear in mind is we're sort of assuming that you're doing this yourself in some way. You're going to look for a book, you're going to choose a board, and then you're going to go and teach it essentially. Quite often you may want to use a course if you don't feel confident enough doing that. Generally, if you're choosing a course from somebody else, that's going to be targeted at a particular board and specification already. So if you've had a look at some resources and you decide this is the person you really want to use, they may well have just chosen the spec for you. And obviously you can look at that both ways. You can say, well, I really like this spec, so I'm going to go and find a course that does this spec. Or you can say, I like this course, I'm going to be, I like this course provider, I'll do whatever they suggest. Also, for all of the GCSE subjects, the Department for Education defines what has to be in there. Sometimes that's quite tightly defined. So for instance, in the maths boards, they've basically all got the same things in there. They do arrange them slightly differently. They'll ask the questions slightly differently, but they'll all have the same topics. For some other subjects, so something like psychology, the DfE defines a number of options, and the boards might have chosen different topics from within those options. So there can be more differences there between the boards. We'll talk about this a bit more for particular subjects at the end. But sometimes it doesn't really matter which board in terms of what you're learning, I mean. Sometimes it does make quite a big difference. So for history, there's lots of different options, and the different boards offer different options. Okay, let's have a quick chat. Is there anything that's sort of generally about boards?
The one thing I will mention is you do not need to stick to the same board for each subject. Choose per subject. So you'll sometimes find there's not a vast amount of difference, and you will develop a preference out of habit because you are familiar with the way a mark scheme works. So you'll drift towards a certain board, maybe more than others, but make the decision based on each subject.
And also check in with your exam centre per subject as well as per board. When you're kind of starting out, exam centres will roughly say, I'm registered with these boards. That means they can offer any exam from those boards. It doesn't mean that they will, because sometimes they're scheduled at weird times and they just decide they don't want to do that. Cambridge in particular, sometimes. The other thing to say about board options is that the international GCSEs have 2 sittings a year. So they have a sitting in June, and as of the end of next year, both Edexcel and Cambridge have a sitting in November. Edexcel also have one in January next year only, and then that's moving to November. So from sort of summer 2023, Edexcel and Cambridge international GCSEs are available in June, and then most of the subjects in November. GCSEs are only available in June. So that can be a reason, again, to go for the international GCSE if you want to spread them out a bit more and do some of them in the summer and then some of them in November. Again, check with your exam centre. Not all of them want to do winter sittings. So some of them may offer Cambridge, but only in the summer. Some of them may prefer, if it's a school, sometimes they prefer the November sittings because they're a bit quieter.
There's a couple of questions in the chat. We'll come back to the provider ones later. We'll ask one about which boards do you think set more predictable questions. That very much depends per subject.
Yeah.
So it is best to ask on the exams group for advice on different specs. For ask per subject.
If you get to the point where you're looking at science and you're like, right, what are people's experiences of either Cambridge or Edexcel? I can't really choose. What do you think? Then that's the place to ask for specific experiences.
I'm going to speed through maths because I'm aware of the time. So maths is a quick one because no maths options have coursework, non-examined assessments. So basically for maths, you can do what your exam centre will let you do. It's as simple as that. So all the GCSEs, as Katie said a few times, the content for the maths GCSEs is very, very similar. So if you've got a choice of GCSEs, look at the papers. Which style of papers do you prefer? They are all free papers. They're all an hour and a half long. The first paper is non-calculator and the second 2 are calculator. But it's in the wording of the questions where you will see the difference. The most popular one is probably Edexcel, but only just over AQA. IGCSEs, very few people do Cambridge. Cambridge maths feels slightly harder from the grades we've seen. When people talk about IGCSE maths, they tend to jump to Edexcel, which is probably the most common one, that is the most common option that home educators do. There are 2 specifications offered by Edexcel for international GCSE maths. You want to do specification A in the UK. There's specification B, which is generally set abroad. And the resources you buy, the textbooks you see posted, they are all written for specification A. So that is the one to do. You can do functional skills. Functional skills exams can be taken online, but they are not directly comparable to GCSE. They haven't got as wide a spread of content. The way they are assessed are different. So they may not be accepted for college entry, depending on what you want to do. So some people will find yes, they are. Some people are finding no, they're not. So it very much depends on what you want. And they're not necessarily easier. They are written for they're written for adults who have not achieved GCSE English and need a maths qualification at that level. So the questions are quite wordy. They can be the right choice for some people. It's always worth asking at your college whether they will be. It is possible in some places to do maths and English at college, either as part of 14 to 16-year-old schemes, or you may be able to start a level two particularly, and do maths and English alongside. It's always worth speaking to the college yourself, rather than judging it on other people's experiences at their colleges. You need to go and ask yourself for your own. Jump on to English.
Yeah, we'll go to English. I just wanted to come to a quick question in the chat, which is, what is the difference between 9-to-1 grading and A to F? So all of the GCSEs in England used to be graded that A star was the best grade, and then it went A, B, C, D, E, F. About 5 years ago now, they changed the English GCSEs and they added in more grades. So now 9 is the best grade on the English GCSEs, then it goes 9, 8, 7, 6 down to 1. And when they did that, they set it so that a grade 4 in the new grading system was the same as the bottom. So the kind of lowest mark you could get and get a grade 4 was the same as the lowest mark you could get and get a grade C. And the lowest mark you could get and get a grade 7 was the same as the lowest mark you could get and get a grade A. So what it basically means is there's now more grades available. So there used to be an A and an A star in the same space as now there's a 7, an 8 and a 9. So there's just more gradation there. An A star might be the same as an A8, or it might be the same as a 9. So if you know you've got a 9, it's probably a little bit better than an A star, but it's also a little bit easier to get an A star. All of the English GCSEs are now 9-to-1. Edexcel International GCSEs are all 9-to-1. Cambridge iGCSE are running both schemes to get both grading options together. So for most of the subjects for Cambridge, they'll have 2 different numbers, specifications. So for English, it's, oh, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 0900 and 0550.
It's 0990, I think.
Okay, close.
I don't.
Generally, there's an 09 something.
Yeah.
And there's an 05 something, and it's exactly the same subject. It's exactly the same exam paper, I believe.
It's not the same exam paper.
Is it not the same exam paper? Okay.
No.
But it's the same specification. But one of them is graded 9-to-1. One of them is graded A star to F. So you can choose. There isn't really any particular reason to choose one over the other, except that all of the English GCSEs are 9-to-1. So that's what people are most familiar with.
Some exam centres will only give you one option because, as I mentioned, they're different papers. So the more papers they have in an exam centre, obviously the more complicated it is for them. So some of them may only offer usually the 9 to 1.
Yeah, and in Wales, they still do A star to G for the GCSEs. So
some
those
of the
gradings
Cambridge are just letters. Environmental management. This one jumps out. There's a few that don't tend to map to the English subjects usually.
Is it easier to get a higher mark? Only because there's that slightly different settings. So it's slightly easier to get an A star than it is to get a 9. But only just.
But you also have the complication that when some colleges take on averages and how they work that out with the letters. So
yeah,
you're going to want to weigh that up as well.
I mean, generally speaking, as I say, I think most people now are using the 9 to 1 system. So just for consistency, it's probably easier to go for that where there's an option, but don't worry too much about it. Because I suppose, I mean, the other thing of that is if you are expecting to get a very high grade, then a 9 is that slight bit higher than an A star. So having got a 9 is slightly better than having got an A star. But it's the times when that matters are so few that it's not really worth worrying too much about, I think. There's also a question about, will your child need a passport or photo ID to sit an exam? They will need some sort of photo identification, yes. Usually at the time that you book the exam. I mean, a passport is a fairly easy thing. Your citizen card will work. You need to check with your exam centre what it is they'll accept. There are options sometimes where you get a photo and you get it signed by somebody else. And I think HEQA have a particular form to fill out for that. But you need to check with your exam centre exactly what they want for identification. They will want some sort of photo ID. There is no age requirement for sitting GCSEs. Exam centres may set their own rules. It's up to them who they want to accept. But as far as the exam board and the official rules are, you can sit them at any age. Right, let's get on to English because we are starting to get through time. So as we said earlier, there are 2 different English GCSEs. There's English language and there's English literature. Language is basically the one that everybody wants. There are some ways in funding you do literature and not language, but for jobs, for college courses, it's almost always English language that you want. Literature is kind of up to you. Some people like writing the essay. Obviously, if you want to go on and do A-level English literature, that's going to be useful. It might be a requirement. A lot of home educators just don't do literature. They only do the language. So in the English language, the GCSE has got a speaking endorsement where you have to go and you have to give a presentation for 5 minutes and answer some questions. And that goes onto your GCSE certificate. It isn't part of your grade, but it is written on your certificate as a separate, I think it's pass-fail and possibly a distinction. That makes it more difficult for centres because they've got to arrange for you to come in, they've got to record it, they've got to liaise with you for what topic you're going to be doing. Whereas the international GCSE, that's completely optional and pretty much no one does it. So it's usually a lot easier to find a centre to do the international GCSE. It's not impossible. There are some centres that will do that speaking endorsement. It is also possible for you to refuse it, but that's not really enough to get around the requirement for the centre because the centre has to offer it to you. So you will occasionally hear of people will say, well, the centre just said I could say no, and then we didn't do it. That's on the dodgy side of what's allowed. Generally speaking, if they offer in the GCSE, they ought to be doing the speaking endorsement with you. That makes it more difficult. Some centres will do it, but it's safer to do the international GCSE. In English, the content is more different between the specifications. So this is one where it is worth having a look at the style of questions and choosing what is going to suit you the best. So looking at the international GCSEs, the 3 main options are the Cambridge, English Language IGCSE. The Edexcel has a Spec A and a Spec B. And the differences between them, do you want to pop up the chart to remind me?
Oh, no, that's fine.
Oh, not
Oh,
that
maths.
one.
English is there somewhere. I turned it down. Let me get. Right, I'll find it.
Right. We're looking. So
sorting out.
there's different numbers of papers. There's different setups. So for Edexcel A, there are two different papers. Two papers for the exam. You have to sit both of the papers in the same season. One of them is 2¼ hours, and one of them is an hour and a half. With Edexcel A, so that's this one here in the dark blue, it has an anthology of extracts. So those are pieces that you study beforehand, and then in the exam, they will ask you to write something about those pieces, and also about some pieces you haven't seen, and then also some creative writing and what we call a transactional writing. And that's something like a letter or a speech where you're writing to do something in particular, you're not just telling a story. So I think that's, to my mind, it's the most similar to the GCSE, but it's still different. So it's partly personal preference. Having that anthology, some people like that because it means you kind of know what you're likely to get when you go into the exam. You're not faced with something completely unknown. You're going to be writing on something that you've studied before and you've got an idea what to say about. On the other side of that, some people don't like having things to study. They quite like the fact that you just learn some skills and then go in on the exam, and there's not, to some extent, there's not as much to revise for. Specification B for Edexcel is one paper that is 3 hours long. And it has all of the different questions within that paper. So it's got some unseen texts. Again, there's nothing to prepare for Edexcel B. And then it has two writing tasks. So one of them is the transactional. It's a letter or a speech or an article where you're told to write on a particular subject, to do something, to persuade someone of something, that sort of thing. And then there's a creative writing task, which will be narrative, discursive, or descriptive. So that means you tell a story or you describe an event. So it's, I mean, Sarah, you've chosen this one. It's sort of suits people who aren't as keen on the literature side of things, I think.
Yes, I think what puts a lot of people off is the 3 hours, because it is a long paper. But
and also that it is only one paper, because that's, in a way, that's good. It's over and done with. But on the other side, if you're ill that day, or if you just have a bad day, don't sleep very well the night before, then that's kind of it. Whereas with two papers, it evens that out a little bit more.
Yeah. Descriptive is the other one. So it's narrative, discursive, or descriptive. So mine like the discursive. That was one of the reasons why we went for it, because particularly my youngest isn't an English fan, but he's done history, he's done sociology, he learned to write essays, arguing a point. So we were able to cover English that way. So that can be a factor.
And Cambridge one is another two papers, an hour and a half and an hour and 3/4. It has unseen text. So the paper one is, can you understand the text? Can you do a summary of it? And then you do the transactional, and that's actually a response to the text. So it's sort of, I haven't looked at the question styles exactly, but it's writing something in particular about the text. And then the paper two is persuasive writing. So that's kind of, again, a speech or that sort of a thing. And then a descriptive or a narrative piece. So that's got that creative writing side on it. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. And again, there is a functional skills option for English that does have a compulsory speaking element, but there are companies that will let you do that. You can either sometimes do it at a night course at college, or there are some companies that will do that online. So you can do the exam at home online. Same caveats with functional skills. It is not a direct equivalent to GCSE. Some colleges might accept it, others won't. It depends what course you want to be going on for afterwards. And again, sometimes there are 14 to 16 options at college, but that depends on what's in your local area. You can sometimes do your English GCSE alongside a vocational course at college. Those courses are often targeted at people who have been through school, taken the exam and not got the grade that they wanted. So they're not always got as much teaching involved as a regular GCSE course. They're thinking, you've already been taught this, we're just going to brush it up and try the exam again. So again, look at what's available at the college before you sort of rely on that as an option. So anything else particularly on English?
I'm going to make the suggestion, Katie, that we actually make this into a two-parter. So
yes, I'm going to say there's still quite a lot to go through.
yeah, so we've got an awful lot still that we were going to cover. So should we leave the rest? We'll leave science and the other subjects to next month and take a few questions.
Yep, that sounds good.
So there was one about whether it's best to study over 1 or 2 years. Now, a lot of people like to do them over 1 year, do a batch of 2 subjects or 3 subjects, or move on, and then move on. We didn't really, personally, I didn't do it that way. We sort of drifted. Some of them we took 2 years, some of them took, some of them we did in 1 year, some of them we did in shorter periods altogether. Some of them seem to drag on for 3 or 4 years because of COVID. So it really comes down to what works for your child and what works for you. So people will tell you how they did it. You've got to work out how it works for you. But there's one thing, you've got time, so you can start studying it. And if you find that 1 year is the pace that you set to study it in 1 year is too fast, slow down. There's no need to do the GCSEs at 16 if you don't want to. You can take longer. If you find you're studying it and it's going really well, you can speed up and sit the exam when you're ready for it.
And it can be different for different subjects. Some of them have just got a lot of content in, and it's quite hard to shove that into a year. Others, particularly something like maths, if you've been doing maths already, you may be able to do that quite quickly to get it to exam ready. You may also find it speeds up over the years. So at first you need to go slowly because you're just learning about how to do exams. And then by year 11, if they've already done 2 or 3 exams already, it's easier to then put another one in for a year. So you kind of need to experiment. And if you are in the position that you've got a younger child and you're looking ahead to think about it, something that we've basically done 1 exam early just to see how it all works out. We've deliberately chosen one that doesn't matter too much for their, future careers or future options. I think for one child we did business, the other we did astronomy. So they were sort of spare subjects essentially that they were interested in. And that allowed us to see how we worked together, how long we needed to take, how the exams worked out, and it didn't matter too much what the result was. So if you've got time, that can be quite a useful thing to do. Whether or not you take the exam, to be honest, you just start studying at the GCSE level and see how long it's going to take for your particular child. So, when do you need to book exams by for summer 23? That does depend on your exam centre. I would leave it another week or so till the main exam season is over. And then it's worth asking now. Usually it's sometime in the autumn term. Some of them won't confirm it till February. Sometimes they'll be full by October. So it's certainly worth asking now. It won't be completely confirmed until January, February. Usually you can pull out and change your mind by then without it costing too much. That check with your exam centre. They may have separate arrangements there. Yeah, so this is the thing about, so someone's asked, don't you have to book the exam quite far ahead? Yes, but typically, at least as far as the exam board is concerned, up to about February, it isn't confirmed, and it's often quite easy to change the sittings before that date. It does depend on your exam centre. Some of them will have admin fees for that. So you need to check on it.
I'll jump in quickly with that last one. Because I tutor history.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is hard. My son actually found that doing history helped him with English language because he doesn't like English. So he learned to write through history. So it can be, I don't particularly think English language is good preparation for history because it's a different style of writing, the narrative. But it's anything that builds up your writing skills. They can work together. I'll jump in quickly with, there was another one. We had access arrangements. I think we need to do a session on access arrangements and rope in some bit more knowledgeable than us.
Yeah, for now, I would say have a look at the exams wiki. There is a page on there about access arrangements that's worth just reading to get an overview of what sorts of things are available.
And you do need to speak to your exam centre, because what they ask for differs. So some people will say we asked for this. It will depend on your exam centre to some extent. So
the exam centre has to assess the need for your child. It's not, there aren't any particularly fixed rules. The idea is that they look at what your child needs in order to access the exams the same as they would do if they didn't have whatever their issue is. So it's a case-by-case decision that the exam centre needs to make about what access arrangements are appropriate. But there are some sort of standard things that are available.
A couple of questions about costs. So the main costs are the exams themselves, and that can vary hugely, depending on where you use. Some schools will do them for effectively cost price, which is the exam board fee, which for GCSEs is about an average of about £43. For IGCSEs, I think it was £53.70p per edit cell this year, and Cambridge is a bit more. Most centres charge extra on top of that because it's worth putting on exams. So they need to pay invigilators, they need to hire rooms, etc. So schools tend to be cheaper than commercial centres, but commercial centres can offer you more options sometimes. So it's a balancing act. You've also then got costs involved in travelling. Most people have some travel costs to do with exams. It might even involve hotels away if you've had to go a fair distance. And then the study costs. And that is largely up to you. We've done most of ours from textbooks, and we could have done those for maybe about £30 if I bought them secondhand and been a bit more frugal, but I'm a buy every book going person. If you are paying tutors, you could be paying £40 an hour. There are cheaper tuition options of group classes, either online or in person. So they tend to range between about 250 and about 350, I would think, for group classes.
Yeah, sort of over a year, that's usually about that. That works out as sort of £9 or £10 a class for a week, and I think that's about average for a group class.
And then you've got recorded video options, or buy a course that comes in the post, which tend to be slightly cheaper still. How much depends on how much tuition support. So it's varied, I think is the answer.
It depends on your budget and what you're looking for on the teaching side. We did do a survey about these costs for this summer. The average there came out as £160 per GCSE subject. So I tend to say if you budget £200 for the exam per subject, then you should be all right for that, and you might be able to get it cheaper, which is a bonus. But roughly speaking, that's that, and it will vary depending on where you are, and depending on where you can travel. And that's a shame, really, because it ought to be the same for everybody, but unfortunately at the moment it isn't.
I'll answer that a nice quick easy one. Regional exam, IGCSEs are offered internationally, so they have different papers because of different time zones. So depending where in the world you are, you will either sit a standard paper or you will sit a paper R for edit cell. They are the same specification. You can use them for practice, but they're just different exam papers to avoid the risk of security with them getting leaked. Cambridge, they use number system, but there's often 2 or 3 versions of a Cambridge paper produced for a particular series because of it being offered internationally, so they can run it at different times. I think the other question that's come up a few times is ages. So you can start whenever you want. As to how long before you do it before going to A level, then some like to see more recent study. It depends on the subject. The maths, you might want to carry on with some sort of maths. So it might be further maths, it might be statistics. Science, they might ask you for some proof that they've got recent experience of studying the subject. But for others, having the subject might not be a requirement of getting onto the A level in the first place. So it doesn't really matter. In terms of age, of how late you can do them whatever age you want. The only issue is college funding. I think Katie will correct me if I'm wrong with this. You have to be started before your 19th birthday.
Yeah, you have to start in the
the
September in which you are 18, essentially.
Yeah.
And you have to be there's a slight gotcha in that has to be, you're then funded for whichever course you start then. So if you start A levels, you're funded for the full 2 years. If you start one of the BTEC courses that is actually split into 2 one-year courses, then you'll only get funding for that first year, because it's whichever whichever course of learning starts at that time. So again, college websites and college admissions officers are good people to talk to if you're considering sort of running it a bit later than usual. You can just drop an email to your local college, or the college that you might well go to, admission service.
Yeah, of course, Christine. Have you got something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. All it was when you said about the funding, that's, like the starting the level 3 courses. Obviously, you're absolutely correct about the 19th birthday, but it doesn't mean you can't do the course, because we had this issue with my 19-year-old. It means if you miss the age, you'd have to pay for it. Although in England, there is some move about, if it's your first level 3 course, you might be eligible for it free as well, if you pass the age. But mine started a 2-year level 3 course before his 19th birthday. We just had to make sure that they definitely decided that his 2-year was solid, that they weren't going to wait a few weeks to decide, because it was an October birthday, as to whether it was a 1 year or 2 years. So I said, no, you need to put him in for the 2 years so that he doesn't miss out. So we don't have to pay for his 2nd year of his course, and that all went fine. So I just thought it was useful to mention that. Yeah,
we should have mentioned the other funding pots. So we were talking about the funding for 16 to 19-year-olds, but there are, as you mentioned, if you're 19, you're not out the question of getting funded. It just comes from a different pot.
Yeah, because sometimes I think, if you've got like extra needs, they end up ending up that bit later, and if they've got an early birthday in the academic year as well. So that's why I thought it was useful.
Yeah. I mean, generally speaking, people will often go an extra year over and basically nobody notices. So that's very rarely a problem. And then the older you get, just be a little bit more careful about looking for where that funding will be coming from. There are always options. So, always do what is the right thing for your child. Don't try and force things through that aren't right just because you think you've got a date to hit. Otherwise, it's all going to go wrong. There are always options. You can always find, a next level and something to sort out.
Textbooks and resources, Amazon for a lot of them is, or other. I should say there are other booksellers. You can buy secondhand from other home educators. You can buy from the publishers' websites, and some of them offer a discount to home educators, so it's worth asking. There are some of the subject pages on the wiki have links to the current textbooks. I am up to halfway through English literature in checking that they are all up to date and right. It's a long, slow process because there are a lot of subjects. So it's worth checking there because there's often links to other resources besides just the textbooks. And ask on the exams group. And you'll also find, if you're on the exams group, there's a list of in the files of subject specific groups that are set up to support people studying without tutors. They are brilliant places for information. They're mostly run by home educators who have got quite a bit of experience of the specs. They've either taken their own child through or ended up tutoring it as well in some cases because they've got a background in it. So they are generally willing to share their knowledge.
And yes, those are mostly on Facebook. So there's on Facebook, there's the big HE exams and alternatives group. And there's masses and masses of people in that have got all sorts of experience over everything. There are also separate groups for many of the subjects that are just focused in on maths. So for instance, there's I've got a GCSE maths group and you can ask maths and statistics questions there. And that can be about the spec. We're happy for you to say, I've got this maths question, I don't know how to answer it, can you help? In those sorts of groups, you can get that level of support as well. It's not tutoring, I want to be clear about that, but we'll help out where we can. Marks, so someone's asked, how do we access mark schemes remember those on the exam board website that we pointed to where they've got specifications? If you have a look at exam materials on there or something similar, this is the Edexcel boards, they give you the past papers, the exams that have been sat before, and they will include, do you want to find a
subject that's a bit simple than
your options? Maths day.
I'd say history is the worst one to look at. Let's find a GCSE. What should we do?
Yeah, pick a maths, that's straightforward.
It's not that.
I say because I know maths.
I have to say it's not that simple for the GCSE actually, but there's less of them. So here we go.
Pick a year.
So
yeah, you're right. There's higher and yes,
higher and foundation for maths. But
yes, so some subjects have both a higher and a foundation tier, which we didn't mention earlier. They're targeted at different levels. So the foundation tier, the most you can get is a grade 5, and the questions, it's usually less content and it's also often less complicated questions in the way that they're asked, because they're targeted at people who are likely to get anywhere between a 1 and a 5. And then the higher tier is targeted at a grade 4 up to a grade 9. So that often has more content and more complicated questions. So if you're thinking you're about a grade 5, obviously you could choose either one of those. It takes a lot fewer marks to get that grade 5 on the higher paper, but then you're faced with much more complicated questions. So it's kind of a personal choice as to how your child will react. Would they rather have questions that they're pretty sure they can cope with, but they've got to get most of them right in order to try and get that 5? Or would they be happy to cope with a paper where they know that there's a lot of them they're just not going to be able to touch at all, but they don't have to get as many right in order to get the 5? So often it's looking at the past papers, trying them out, seeing what you think will work. So on here, if we pick a question paper 1H, that means it's the higher paper 1 for maths. So you can look at that. This is the exact exam paper that was given to them in the exam that year. And that's what they had to sit down and answer. So you can print those out yourself at home. You get your child to sit them. I generally wouldn't advise actually getting your child to sit them until quite late on when they've actually covered the content. It can be a really good way to learn, but it's also a bit stressful to be faced with an exam paper of something you don't know anything about. And again, there's a particular time to do that. When you're in the exam, you don't have to practice to that time. You can just work through them as learning questions and then only try them for time when you're quite close to the exam. And then if we go back to the page, there will be a mark scheme that matches that paper. So mark scheme 1H somewhere. There we go. And this matches all the questions. It gives you general rules for how you mark. And here you can see here, it gives you what the actual answer is. And then there's individual marks. So often it will be, if you look at that question 5, there were 3 marks available there, and it tells you what sorts of things you had to put there. If you didn't get the right answer, but you did some of the working to get there, it tells you what you're looking for to award those marks. And the mark schemes vary depending on the subject. For maths, it's quite prescriptive, and it's usually relatively easy to match that up. For something like English, it is not very easy at all. It has what they call levels, and you have to read an essay, and then you have to say, is this a sustained argument, or is it a coherent argument, or words to that effect? And I find those very difficult.
There is a trick to marking.
I'm sure there is. I haven't
there
learned
is
it yet.
I think there's scope a few times down to actually do for us to do something for marking, because I can do level marking. I've marked enough of them by now.
Well, there we go. That might go on our list of things to do. I'd be quite
I
interested.
think we've got a few to do first. I think
so. Yeah, but you do get those mark schemes, so you can see what they're looking at. Some of them you may find really straightforward. Some of them you don't. There are also services that will just do marking for you. So if you're with the course, sometimes the tutor will mark for you. You can also, there's one in particular called Mark My Papers that I've used. There may be others as well, where you get your child to sit a paper and you scan it and you send it off to them, and they get an exam marker to mark it for you and give feedback. So you obviously pay for that because you're paying for somebody else's services, but that can be a useful way to get a kind of a mock marked or get some feedback on your marking as well.
And the other thing with the marking is asked on the subjects group, because people will have experience to share. Most people of that is nobody will mark it for you on there, but they will help and give you guidance based on what their own experience. As to how much it costs, I think I've used it for, I think I paid about £40 for the 3-hour English papers.
Yeah, it does depend on the length of the paper. And I mean, obviously these prices are subject to change. At the moment, the last time I paid, it was £25 for an hour and a half paper, and then it obviously got more the longer the papers were. And that's first, you can get a single paper marked as well. You don't have to get a whole exam. You can just get the paper that you've sat marked.
I think there's one more question I noticed about whether you can choose between the regional version or the standard IGCSE. No, you can't. In the UK, it is the standard IGCSE paper. The R version is for somewhere that's a different time zone. So they're the same spec. They're not, no paper is more difficult or easier than the other, theoretically. They're supposed to be written roughly to be they're aimed to be written to the same level, let's put it that way. And if they're not, it's adjusted for in the grade boundaries. So
and what can be useful there is when you're looking at the past papers that are available on the website. For the international GCSEs, there's often more available because if they have used both a regional and a local sitting, that's 2 papers for an exam season instead of 1 that you'll get for the GCSE. And also if it's one that's they're sitting twice a year, again, you've got some more sittings. Whether those are unlocked is a separate question, but there are more past papers that have been written and marked that you can use for practice.
On the other side, there's quite often more resources for the GCSEs in terms of exam practice papers, books. So it can counter it. I wouldn't necessarily
it's
always
pros and cons,
but it's pros and cons on both sides. I think we've overrun by about 20 minutes.
We are quite over time, I think.
Yeah, we were going to plan another one for a month's time. So I think we'll do it through Eventbrite again, and we'll put it on groups fairly soon.
Yeah.
And it is recorded, and we'll get it sorted on YouTube as soon as possible.
Yeah, it'll take a few days, but that should be up by some point next week. And I think through Eventbrite, I can send that out to you. And I'll also pull together a PDF just with useful links. So things like the wikis that we've mentioned, and the Facebook groups where the exam board websites are. And we'll get that sent out.
So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. It's been useful. Every question's been good. Helps everybody else.
I'm going to get this recording.